A document classification review was initiated on January 14th. The Department of Justice published what they claimed was a comprehensive public dossier on January 28th. Pam Bondi testified under oath on February 11th and explicitly stated that no evidence existed. 3 separate FBI interview records are completely unaccounted for. Throughout this entire sequence of events, we are not looking at administrative mistakes, but rather a deliberate chronological progression. Exactly 52 pages vanished between those specific dates, neither sealed nor reclassified nor moved to a secure vault, but entirely erased from public view. Furthermore, each of those missing pages referenced the exact same individual, Donald Trump. These were not mere fragments or heavily censored paragraphs, but complete FBI witness records that should never disappear because they are not summaries. They are sworn recollections securely captured line by line inside a document called an FD 302. Allow me to contextualize this perfectly before proceeding, as the following details rely on concrete facts rather than mere conjecture. This represents a distinct chain of events corroborated by digital timestamps, official document registries, and sworn statements. Rather than a standard congressional inquiry, this serves as a calculated revelation of how critical proof can be suppressed before the public even realizes its existence. An FD 302 serves as the authoritative documentation of an official FBI witness interrogation rather than casual administrative paperwork. Each individual declaration is meticulously logged, preserving every minute detail and specific reference. Upon entering a federal investigation, these files form the foundational evidentiary framework utilized by federal prosecutors. Federal agents simply do not casually misplace an FD 302 form. These documents are never accidentally excluded from the official record. When such a file vanishes, its absence serves as direct proof of alternative motives like deliberate obstruction and record manipulation. This is a foundational principle of federal prosecution rather than just dramatic political phrasing. Keep this precise definition in mind, as the subsequent narrative entirely hinges upon comprehending exactly what was concealed. Federal agents formally interviewed the primary witness involved in this timeline on 4 separate occasions, rather than just once or twice, spanning almost 3 years. The initial 2019 discussion remained relatively broad, outlining Jeffrey Epstein's network without specifying exact individuals or geographic locations. This preliminary conversation was released to the public and included within the Justice Department's files to create the illusion of total transparency. During the second session 6 weeks later, the interrogation shifted toward highly specific inquiries regarding previously mentioned associates and venues. This crucial second interview remains entirely absent from the publicly accessible archives. A different team of federal agents conducted a third interrogation 3 months later, which has also vanished from the record. During the fourth session 11 months later, a high-ranking FBI executive attended, signaling a severe escalation in the testimony's gravity rather than standard administrative protocol. This highly sensitive fourth interview is likewise missing from the available files. Out of the 4 verified sessions, only a single one was published while the remaining 3 were suppressed, and every missing interview is logged in an unalterable legal record known as the Maxwell Trial Discovery Log. This specific registry highlights the glaring mathematical inconsistencies. The judicially overseen discovery catalog explicitly lists 15 distinct documents for this particular witness. These 15 authenticated FBI files remain secured under judicial supervision within a criminal prosecution that ultimately secured a conviction. However, when you explore the publicly available Justice Department database, you discover only 7 files rather than the required 15. Exactly 8 official records are completely missing, rather than merely delayed or pending further administrative review. This precise gap of 8 omitted entries represents the stark contrast between the actual judicial archive and the heavily filtered public release. Jamie Raskin physically presented this exact discrepancy in the hearing room that morning, displayed clearly across 2 printed columns. He began his presentation without relying on grand political speeches or preliminary questioning. Instead, he simply provided a document directly contrasting the undeniable reality against the curated public disclosure. The left column displayed the Justice Department's public assertions, while the right column featured the Maxwell trial's official evidentiary log showing 15 records against 7, leaving 8 unaccounted for. Comprehending the legal implications of this is critical, as the situation instantly transitions from simple negligence to potential legal liability. On January 14th, the Justice Department completed a fast-tracked classification review specifically aimed at Epstein-connected interviews involving high-ranking government figures. This represented a highly precise mandate rather than a routine administrative sweep, and it carried a strict deadline requiring full completion prior to the January 28th public disclosure. The official public disclosure ultimately occurred on January 28th. Crucially, the 3 essential FD 302 reports were entirely omitted from this release. When Pam Bondi provided her sworn testimony on February 11th, these files had already been erased from the public system. Consequently, her absolute and unqualified declaration that no evidence implicated Donald Trump was delivered strictly after this deliberate removal took place. This chronological sequence represents the core of the controversy rather than a minor scheduling technicality. Had those absent FD 302 files remained within the public domain, making such a definitive statement would have been virtually impossible. Her phrasing would have required significant alteration, eliminating her absolute certainty and forcing mandatory legal qualifications. Observe the immediate consequences when this established sequence faces intense congressional scrutiny. Roughly 43 minutes into the proceedings, Raskin revealed a secondary internal Justice Department memo originating from January 14th. This specific memo explicitly directed the Internal Review Committee to execute the accelerated document evaluation and outline the parameters isolating Epstein-linked interrogations that mentioned prominent government leaders. This fully traceable and formally signed document explicitly demanded completion before any public disclosure occurred. At this precise juncture, the logical progression becomes entirely inescapable. The formal document evaluation commenced on January 14th. By January 28th, the public received a heavily filtered collection of files. Sworn congressional testimony was subsequently delivered on February 11th. Throughout this entire chronological progression, the 3 crucial FD 302 forms never materialized. These files were meticulously processed and intentionally extracted prior to public exposure or congressional questioning, proving they were not simply delayed. The core issue evolves from questioning their existence, which the court verifies, to determining exactly who orchestrated their removal and when. Thomas Massie engaged with the sequence at this point, acting less like a partisan prosecutor and more like an analytical engineer identifying a systemic failure. He completely bypassed asking for justifications or identifying the individual who commanded the extraction. Instead, he posed a far more perilous and highly targeted inquiry regarding exactly when she received notification. This specific line of questioning inherently presumes pre-existing awareness of the situation and eliminates the possibility of claiming total ignorance or professional detachment. The question forces the testifier to confront the chronological sequence and establish their exact position within it. Crucially, Pam Bondi refused to claim ignorance or explicitly deny having knowledge of the events. She merely countered by stating that all classification judgments follow established bureaucratic procedures. This response functions as an indirect admission heavily disguised by standard bureaucratic terminology rather than a genuine denial. During that specific exchange, the underlying institutional framework suddenly became glaringly apparent. 3 interrogations identifying a distinct individual at Mar-a-Lago were deliberately suppressed before a sworn declaration claimed 0 evidence existed. This involved a targeted review process, a heavily filtered public release, and sworn testimony heavily dependent upon those strategic omissions. This scenario transcends traditional partisan rivalries and standard political maneuvering. The fundamental issue questions whether an evidence-based institution can secretly extract vital proof before public evaluation occurs. If this accurately reflects the sequence of events, the primary concern shifts from spoken testimony to the truths that were forcefully concealed. Consider the basic architecture of this situation using the most grounded and practical perspective. If someone extracted 3 pages from a dossier before demanding your assessment, your resulting conclusions would inherently rely on artificially restricted information. Apply this exact same rational framework to sworn federal testimony delivered before a major congressional oversight panel. The true ethical boundary emerges directly within the glaring divide between the actual reality and the curated presentation. These 8 suppressed files ultimately belong to the American citizenry rather than any specific bureaucratic agency. Once this omission is quantified, formally documented, and clearly displayed across 2 columns, it transforms from a simple error into a highly consequential interrogation. Therefore, the central inquiry regarding this entire narrative requires immediate focus. If vital documentation vanishes prior to a hearing, allowing subsequent statements to exploit that void, what value does a sworn oath truly hold? Experiencing discomfort over this realization indicates a clear understanding of the severe implications at play. Continue paying close attention as the upcoming details become significantly more verified, exact, and impossible to dismiss. Show your support for this video if you strongly oppose the suppression of evidence prior to public disclosure. Provide your perspective in the comments below, since this situation relies on quantifiable data rather than abstract theories. Distribute this breakdown to anyone believing the entire file was published, and subscribe as the next segment elevates this timeline into deeply serious territory. The hearing room hung in absolute suspense for exactly 47 seconds following Massey's direct inquiry. This was an incredibly heavy atmosphere rather than a standard empty silence, carrying the specific tension that arises when an entire room realizes the forthcoming response will completely recontextualize everything. Her posture remained highly calculated, with her hands resting perfectly flat against the table in a controlled manner. This physical demeanor indicated an intense calculation of legal vulnerability rather than a genuine search for factual recall. She stared rigidly forward without consulting her legal team or referencing the binder she previously utilized 43 times. During that crucial instant, her prepared documentation became entirely useless for providing a safe response. The actual truth was completely trapped within the inescapable chronological sequence. Massey intentionally avoided repeating his inquiry or interrupting the prolonged pause. He actively weaponized the silence, transforming a passive moment into immense psychological pressure. Upon finally speaking, she deliberately sidestepped the exact question presented to her. She completely avoided specifying the date she learned about the January 14th document review. Instead, she pivoted to claiming that all determinations pass through proper organizational channels, a distinction that remains the most critical element of their entire interaction. Citing standard procedures fails to provide a legitimate chronological timestamp or a factual refutation. This phrasing acts as a bureaucratic defense mechanism to confirm an action occurred without admitting personal involvement. Reinserting this specific deflection into the chronological timeline is highly revealing. The accelerated document screening officially commenced on January 14th. The heavily filtered public disclosure was fully finalized by January 28th. Official congressional testimony was subsequently provided under oath on February 11th. Throughout this testimony, the witness never explicitly claimed ignorance regarding the January 14th directive. She completely failed to distance herself from this chronological chain of events. She actually validated the existence of the timeline while attributing its execution to standard procedures. Raskin calmly refused to let this deflection succeed without escalating his vocal intensity. He executed a far sharper maneuver by simply detailing the final outcome of these supposed procedures. 3 authenticated FBI interviews implicating a prominent leader were systematically scrubbed from public view right before the Attorney General testified to a lack of evidence. This approach completely eliminated any need for aggressive accusations or wild theorizing. He brilliantly juxtaposed the established timeline against the spoken testimony to highlight the glaring discrepancies. This specific juncture transformed the proceedings from political theater into a rigorous legal interrogation. With the sequence formally established, isolated responses could no longer be judged independently. Each subsequent statement was meticulously compared against heavily verified documentation. The entire atmosphere fundamentally shifted into a distinctly prosecutorial environment. These critical FD 302 files represent concrete reality rather than mere theoretical concepts, as they are securely logged within the judicially governed Maxwell Discovery Ledger. Consequently, these specific archives remain completely immune to retroactive manipulation and possess permanent digital footprints featuring concrete dates, authenticating markers, and judicial verification. When the Justice Department published only 7 out of 15 witness files, they failed to establish an entirely new truth. They merely presented an artificially manipulated variation of a pre-existing legal reality. Falsely labeling this highly redacted database as comprehensive transforms the deception itself into prosecutable evidence. Within this specific legal framework, totality represents a quantifiable metric rather than a matter of opinion. The stark mathematical reality of 8 missing documents requires zero abstract interpretation. Reintegrating the documented review process back into this scenario is essential. The high-speed evaluation protocol targeting all Epstein witness interactions that mentioned prominent government leaders was officially mandated on January 14th. The order firmly required finalization before any widespread dissemination occurred. This command outlined an intensely active filtering mechanism rather than a casual administrative review. It aggressively isolated specific files, imposed a strict deadline, and demanded results before public exposure, meaning the eventual January 28th publication represented a highly curated product. The 3 suppressed FD 302 forms align perfectly with the exact parameters of that internal mandate. Tracing this logical progression step by step makes the systemic hypocrisy entirely impossible to ignore. Identifying these specific interrogations during the rapid assessment confirms they were actively acknowledged. Possessing full awareness of these files while omitting them from publication equals deliberate exclusion. Excluding these records prior to February 11th means they were intentionally unavailable during Bondi's testimony. Consequently, declaring a lack of evidence occurred precisely after the critical proof was forcefully extracted. This presents a verifiable timeline of events rather than a simple partisan allegation, and such glaring chronological inconsistencies demand exact details rather than vague bureaucratic reassurances. Massey's inquiry remains vital because of the hidden truths it forcefully dragged into the spotlight. His interrogation focused entirely on factual awareness rather than analyzing intent or seeking authorization. The primary objective was establishing exactly when the witness gained explicit knowledge of the operation. Possessing knowledge establishes accountability, which dictates whether sworn declarations truthfully represent the complete reality. The witness completely refused to supply a specific date or pinpoint an exact moment of awareness. She meticulously avoided confirming her temporal location relative to the January 14th directive. Her entire defense relied heavily on repeating standard administrative jargon. Analyzing the missing elements of their interaction provides incredible insight. She notably avoided claiming that the FD 302 documents lacked relevance to the investigation or challenging their factual accuracy. She never attempted to justify the omissions by invoking national security concerns and completely ignored the existence of the documents entirely. Within this specific legal environment, silence serves as a highly directional indicator rather than a neutral stance, since the primary foundation of the hearing relied on the assumption of completely unhindered transparency regarding the Epstein files. Total disclosure was the fundamental promise presented to both the committee and the public. However, the introduction of that comparative 2-column document instantly shattered that illusion of transparency. The irrefutable contrast revealed 15 official court files against 7 public ones, leaving 8 unaccounted for, 3 of which represent critical FD 302 forms capturing direct witness testimonies. Simple administrative formatting errors cannot possibly explain such a massive evidentiary void. Standard bureaucratic processing delays fail to justify the complete suppression of these records. This extreme discrepancy absolutely demands a thorough and legitimate explanation. Observe the secondary level of scrutiny, which pushes the implications far beyond the physical hearing room. Following Raskin's questioning, a high-ranking staffer submitted an official written demand to the Majority Council. This represented a highly formalized, heavily documented mandate rather than a casual verbal question. The petition explicitly demanded the comprehensive output generated by the January 14th internal review, requiring access to every single page, authorization, and signature rather than condensed summaries. Upon entering the official congressional record, a strict countdown immediately commenced. The standard bureaucratic protocol dictates a strict 14-day window for fulfilling such demands. The Justice Department received 2 weeks to provide documentation explaining the fate of those 8 files. This time frame offered them a chance to prove the extraction was legally authorized and properly disclosed. The designated response period ultimately expired without the requested comprehensive documentation being provided. This specific refusal compounds massively when viewed alongside the preceding chain of events, connecting the suppressed interviews, accelerated reviews, filtered releases, and sworn testimony to this newly created void. If the internal operations were truly legitimate, the corresponding paperwork would easily validate her claims. Withholding that vital paperwork ensures the official narrative remains highly suspicious and fundamentally incomplete. Ted Lieu engaged precisely at this moment, submitting a formalized written inquiry directly into the legislative record. Rather than peddling baseless theories, Lieu explicitly highlighted a crucial legal differentiation. The internal memo specifically utilized the term accelerated assessment rather than public interest review. These distinct legal definitions cannot simply be swapped interchangeably. Public interest evaluations fundamentally aim to weigh civilian transparency against potential security hazards. This framework heavily favors total transparency unless highly specific risks necessitate redactions. Conversely, a highly compressed assessment executed right before publication functions on entirely different principles, heavily favoring rapid sorting and sweeping categorization rather than careful legal deliberation. Regarding strict congressional transparency laws, this operational distinction is overwhelmingly significant. The power to suppress critical records prior to public distribution is absolutely not infinite. This authority remains strictly governed by legal precedents, established statutes, and predefined operational parameters. Lieu directly challenged the precise legal foundation allowing rapid internal reviews to entirely suppress judicially authenticated evidence before publication, rather than merely redacting or classifying them. This highly consequential interrogation was formally logged into the congressional transcripts. The agency completely failed to provide any written clarification. Take a wider perspective and analyze the massive structural deception that materialized. Judicial logs definitively verify the existence of 15 separate investigative files, while the publicly accessible archives display only 7 available entries. Internal agency mandates commanded the rapid review of these specific files right before publication, and official sworn testimony leaned heavily upon the complete unavailability of those suppressed records. Official demands for procedural clarification were met with absolute silence. The debate over the actual existence of these documents has completely concluded. The remaining concern focuses on whether the governing institution violated its own strict operational boundaries. This transforms from a dry administrative dispute into a fundamental crisis of institutional credibility. If official archives face manipulation prior to disclosure, all subsequent statements inherit that identical corruption. Concealing this manipulation guarantees the public merely consumes an artificially constructed narrative rather than factual evidence. The central inquiry subsequently grows significantly sharper and intensely grounded in reality. The crucial focus targets whether extracting these files fundamentally altered the permissible limits of sworn testimony. Confirming this dynamic elevates the situation from a mere statistical glitch into a highly organized operation. Organized frameworks require deliberate intent, which immediately triggers severe legal classifications when combined with sworn testimony. This legal reality heavily depends on the consistency between factual awareness and spoken declarations. Consequently, the core inquiry tightens into an incredibly specific and focused interrogation. This represents the exact type of questioning that completely eliminates evasive maneuvers. Exactly what factual awareness did Pam Bondi possess when declaring a total lack of evidence, and what crucial materials were intentionally scrubbed from the archives prior to her statement? The crime of perjury remains entirely detached from political affiliations or conversational tones. Perjury exclusively involves intentionally delivering a massive falsehood regarding relevant materials while under oath. The critical factor centers completely on the very real existence of vital evidence. Furthermore, FD-302 files serve as foundational proof rather than irrelevant supplementary paperwork. These represent verified interrogations permanently cemented within unalterable federal legal archives. Considering these files existed, were flagged during review, and subsequently removed prior to testimony, personal awareness remains the final variable. Did the testifier explicitly realize these suppressed records existed while delivering her absolute declarations? Confirming her awareness instantly upgrades her testimony from functionally incomplete to potentially criminal. Massey's highly specific interrogation gains increasing significance upon closer examination. He actively avoided questioning broad organizational policies or standard administrative workflows. He ruthlessly targeted personal awareness by demanding the exact timing of her notification. Positioning her awareness prior to January 28th confirmed she knew the release was highly compromised. Establishing her knowledge before February 11th proved she understood the deception prior to testifying. Placing her awareness post-January 14th verifies she understood the internal review was actively occurring. However, she brilliantly avoided providing any concrete chronological anchor points. She continuously weaponized bureaucratic jargon to validate the operation without exposing her personal involvement. This intentional evasion completely abandons any pretense of neutrality. Within such an incredibly rigid timeline, every single omitted detail functions as compelling proof. Analyzing the explosive contents of those suppressed documents dramatically escalates the severity of the situation. The interrogated witness completely abandoned vague generalizations during those subsequent sessions. The interrogation became intensely precise, ultimately identifying Mar-a-Lago as a primary location. This represented a highly concrete venue intrinsically connected to a prominent leadership figure during the hearing. Furthermore, federal agents meticulously logged these devastating claims across several separate interrogations. Every subsequent interview expanded upon previous claims, locking highly refined details inside official FD-302 records. The third and fourth interrogation sessions represent the absolute pinnacle of importance. The presence of new agents and top-tier executives highlighted a massive escalation in internal scrutiny. Standard interrogations never command this extreme level of executive oversight, which only occurs when explosive testimony demands elite validation. Shockingly, those highly escalated files are exactly the ones entirely missing from the archives. Consider the terrifying implications of this reality using the most basic logical framework. A witness provides increasingly detailed testimony triggering massive FBI escalation, yet those exact documents vanish before public dissemination. Simultaneously, prominent officials boldly declare under oath that absolutely zero evidence exists. Such a flawless chronological alignment destroys any possibility of sheer coincidence. This structured progression fits together far too perfectly for anyone to safely dismiss. This reality pushes the proceedings into a deeply unsettling territory requiring highly uncomfortable distinctions. It highlights the terrifying gap between absolute truth and manipulated public awareness. The official Maxwell trial discovery ledger never actually changed. The registry consistently maintained the existence of 15 authentic files. Judicial authorities never authorized extractions, nor did the permanent archive fluctuate. Because only the civilian database changed, the institution successfully manipulated optics rather than losing physical documents. Comprehending this manipulation instantly clarifies the remaining layers of this massive operation. The mid-January mandate sought to isolate highly specific pre-existing documents rather than discovering new evidence. It meticulously targeted Epstein-linked interrogations that heavily implicated prominent leaders. The Internal Review Board merely located these explosive files rather than generating them. Upon isolating these records, the committee faced a critical decision regarding their inclusion in the public drop. This specific choice represents the ultimate catalyst, dictating the entire trajectory of subsequent events. The public received redacted files while the hearing progressed blindly until a simple comparison shattered the deception. Pay close attention to Raskin's subtle yet incredibly devastating maneuver during this exchange. He completely avoided presenting previously undiscovered documents or entirely new evidentiary claims. He simply forced an immediate visual comparison between the authenticated legal archives and the heavily filtered public release. This elementary juxtaposition was entirely sufficient to destroy the prevailing narrative. Proving the existence of the FD 302 forms was unnecessary, as the judiciary had already verified them. He never needed to mathematically prove the omissions, since the public database explicitly confirmed the absence. He merely placed the unalterable truth directly beside the carefully constructed deception. Once physically aligned, the massive discrepancies instantly transformed from theoretical arguments into glaring realities. The unassailable math confirmed 15 documents against 7, highlighting 8 completely missing files. Returning to the strict legal parameters forces the terminology to become razor-sharp. The crime of perjury demands immense materiality, absolute falsehood, and deliberate awareness. The severe relevance of these documents remains entirely beyond dispute. Crucial investigative evidence connected to high-profile scandals inherently meets the threshold for extreme materiality. Determining falsehood relies entirely upon whether the absolute denial of evidence survives the reality of the suppressed FD 302s. Furthermore, confirming deliberate awareness heavily depends upon positioning Pam Bondi within that highly specific sequence. The congressional proceedings successfully unearthed this massive vulnerability rather than fully resolving it. While simple exposure falls short of absolute proof, it creates the necessary foundation for future legal validation. After formalizing the sequence, locating the records, and quantifying the omissions, the situation progresses far beyond mere inference. The primary objective immediately shifts toward aggressive document recovery. This requires securing the complete January 14th assessment, including all associated pages, commands, and authorizations. Those specific files contain the definitive truth regarding this massive suppression effort. Consequently, heavily concealing this administrative output proves just as damning as suppressing the actual witness testimonies. Without releasing this paperwork, the institution demands absolute blind faith while aggressively hiding their operational mechanics. This dynamic perfectly highlights the rapidly hardening ethical boundaries surrounding this scandal. This crisis heavily eclipses the actions of a single individual or one isolated declaration. It questions whether the fundamental machinery governing legal evidence functions honestly during critical national moments. If institutional tools selectively filter reality prior to congressional hearings, sworn testimony becomes deeply compromised. It becomes heavily reliant upon heavily curated remainders while ignoring massive extractions. When sworn statements rely on artificial conditions, the governing oath completely disintegrates. Consequently, the core issue transitions from philosophical debates into highly technical procedural demands. Will the governing authorities finally release these 3 suppressed FD 302 documents? Until that happens, massive shadows of doubt permanently infect every single declaration delivered during those proceedings. This entire narrative remains trapped within the unforgiving dates of January 14th, January 28th, and February 11th. Throughout that precise chronological progression, 3 critical files remained continually absent. This represents a highly calculated operational pattern rather than a simple bureaucratic error. Such distinct methodologies require thorough explanations, otherwise they face inevitable public exposure. The events unfolding inside that chamber completely failed to clarify these glaring discrepancies. Instead, it amplified the contradictions and established a rigid legal framework extending far outside those walls. It now resides permanently within the legislative archives, rendering it totally immune to silent redactions or dismissals. Formalizing such a timeline transforms a fleeting interaction into a permanent historical anchor. Exactly 14 days was the precise time frame provided for the Justice Department to surrender the complete January 14th administrative logs. They received 2 weeks to clearly demonstrate the evaluation process concerning those 8 suppressed files. This offered ample time to prove Bondi's claims of appropriate processes could actually survive intense forensic auditing. The compliance deadline officially expired without full document production, complete explanations, or alignment between internal operations and public disclosures. When institutions deliberately ignore opportunities to resolve massive inconsistencies, their silence transforms into highly damning evidence. Within this high-stakes environment, administrative silence operates as a heavily cumulative indicator of guilt rather than neutrality. Take a moment to analyze the catastrophic reality left behind following this expired deadline. Unshakable judicial registries continue confirming 15 authentic FBI files connected to one witness, while the restricted public repository displays a mere 7. Exactly 8 files remain entirely missing from the public eye, 3 of which represent FD 302 forms capturing explicit witness testimony. A rapid internal screening launched on January 14th specifically hunted for this exact evidentiary category before the subsequent data dump on January 28th strategically excluded them. An official sworn declaration on February 11th falsely insisted that 0 evidence remained. Thomas Massey's intense questioning successfully highlighted institutional awareness despite failing to secure an exact timeline, and Ted Lieu's formal interrogation regarding the legal justification for these extractions met absolute silence. Aggressive legislative demands for complete internal paperwork resulted in massive stonewalling. This completely transcends isolated errors, representing a highly coordinated operational chain. Dismantling such networks requires surgical precision rather than vague bureaucratic generalizations. This necessitates uncovering exact dates, pinpointing critical decisions, and matching specific names to direct authorizations. The true heart of this scandal involves the high-level executives who actively authorize these suppressions. The mid-January directive features a prominent authorizing signature belonging to a top-tier executive within the Justice Department. Because the document remains unclassified, the executive's identity and the exact chain of command are completely exposed. However, the underlying logic bridging this authority to the massive redactions remains completely obscured. Why were those specific files targeted for extraction, and why was that accelerated chronological sequence strictly enforced? Why did the extraction mandate require completion prior to public distribution? These incredibly grounded inquiries carry massive legal weight rather than serving as mere philosophical thought experiments. If the rapid review functioned legally, the internal paperwork would easily vindicate the entire operation. Conversely, aggressively hiding this paperwork utterly destroys the operation's credibility rather than protecting it. Revisit the massive declaration that initially ignited this entire investigation, stating absolutely no evidence exists. These highly definitive words were presented under oath without a single legal qualification. However, this absolute assertion can no longer survive in a vacuum. This testimony now resides within a heavily documented framework featuring suppressed files, tight timelines, ignored subpoenas, and highly targeted document purges. Placing sworn testimony within this manipulated framework fundamentally alters its core definition. The debate over whether the declaration actually occurred has entirely vanished. The true focus questions whether this testimony accurately reflected the speaker's total factual awareness during delivery. This rigid standard completely disregards personal intent or vague semantic interpretations in favor of strict alignment between the spoken narrative and the heavily documented reality. Failing this alignment elevates the situation from poor communication to potential perjury. Evaluating the massive downstream effects reveals implications stretching far beyond specific individuals or files. If administrative reviews can secretly suppress vital evidence before congressional hearings, institutions are effectively weaponizing data rather than managing it. This completely controls the baseline reality used to evaluate sworn congressional testimony. This precise dynamic highlights the massive divide between genuine transparency and authoritarian control. True transparency permits citizens to review unedited archives and formulate independent deductions. Authoritarian control dictates exactly what evidence survives public release, artificially steering all resulting conclusions. Operating this control mechanism in total secrecy severely contaminates far more than a single congressional inquiry. It absolutely annihilates the credibility of every single declaration leaning upon those manipulated archives. Citizens are essentially evaluating heavily redacted propaganda rather than processing raw, unadulterated facts. This represents a massive structural and ethical collapse rather than standard partisan bickering. Does the governing institution provide unedited truths during sworn testimony, or do they present manipulated narratives disguised as comprehensive files? If they actively curate the archives, the sworn oath completely loses its historical significance. The pledge transforms into a guarantee covering only the highly sanitized remnants deemed safe for public consumption. This represents an incredibly massive and terrifying ideological shift. This dynamic separates legitimately accountable governance from institutions actively managing civilian perception. Therefore, analyzing the events within that hearing room is no longer the primary objective. The congressional transcripts have already cemented those interactions into history. The ultimate concern focuses intensely on the immediate future. Will the governing authorities finally surrender the comprehensive January 14th administrative paperwork? Will the 3 suppressed FD 302 files finally reach the public in their unedited, court-verified formats? Or will this sequence finally receive factual answers rather than endless bureaucratic deflections? Or will these massive evidentiary voids become permanent fixtures? Allowing these gaps to persist ensures the corrupt operational framework survives indefinitely. Consequently, all future declarations regarding this scandal will buckle under the immense pressure of these unresolved manipulations. 52 pages, 15 files, 7 published, 8 suppressed, 4 interrogations, 1 disclosed, 3 vanished. These stark mathematical realities remain completely unalterable. The sole remaining variable is whether these glaring discrepancies ever receive a legitimate justification. Carefully consider the following question, recognizing its massive implications for this entire narrative. If critical proof can be systematically flagged and extracted prior to congressional hearings, what exactly validates the sworn testimony presented to the public? If that answer proves elusive, the primary crisis revolves around what was deliberately hidden rather than what was merely misplaced. Like this video to boost visibility if you firmly believe official documents require total public disclosure before any sworn testimony occurs. Provide your thoughts in the comment section, as this breakdown relies on heavily verified timelines rather than wild speculation. Distribute this analysis to anyone still defending the completeness of the public files, as the raw data proves otherwise, and hit subscribe.